Well, thank you for your gracious invitation. It is my distinct honor to make your acquaintance, and I trust that your time will not have been wasted listening to my story. It's intended to strengthen your faith in our great Redeemer and our wonderful Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. I can safely assume that by my manner of dress and speech, you've already concluded that I'm probably not from around here. Well, you're quite correct. I was born in London in 1725, just 7 years before your George Washington. We lived along the River Thames, the port call of many a sailing vessel. My father was a merchant seaman, gone for many months at sea. I really didn't know him very well. I assume he loved me in his own way, but I never really felt loved by him, although I respected him, but mainly I greatly feared him. On the other hand, my mother was a tender, devout, godly Christian woman, and I was educated at her knee. She taught me to read by reading the scriptures. By age 4, I was able to read most common books in English. She taught me to pray. She taught me the hymns of Isaac Watts. She taught me mathematics. Very sadly, my mother died just before my 7th birthday. And I was devastated, brokenhearted, very hurt and angry at the world. And there began a bitterness and an anger in my heart that would increase through the years against God. I didn't understand why he would have taken her away from me. Well, my father returned from sea and soon remarried to a beautiful woman who bore him more children. I felt somewhat of an outsider in my home. I don't know that she was terribly interested in me, and I found my fellowship with the street urchins, children who ran the streets of London, and I joined them. And I learned their ways. They were profane and careless children. We'd snatch an apple, get a loaf of bread, and run down the alley and laugh about it. The constables were frequent visitors at our home. It was apparent to my father that I was more than my mother could control, and so he put me in a boarding school. But it was not long that I was expelled for swearing, fighting, and general disobedience. So he put me in another boarding home. But soon I was expelled from that home for pretty much the same reasons. So my father decided the only remedy was to take me aboard my father's ship. And so at the age of 11, I was assigned as a cabin boy. And he strictly warned the crew, "Never mind the fact that he's my son, I expect you to exact the same discipline as you would expect from any other sailor. My job was to do whatever the older sailors requested, whether it was for cleaning or food, whatever it was, I was to do their bidding. Bring me another square, boy. A bit more grog, lad. The ship's head has got such a stench to it, it's blotting out the sun. Get it cleaned and make it quick." A few landlubbers, the ship's head is the ship's bathroom. Well, as harsh as the discipline was, I rather enjoyed it, observing the professionalism of the seamen, particularly in a storm. But instead of praying, I learned to curse and blaspheme. And so, at the age of 17, I had become an able-bodied seaman. And my father thought it was time for me to set my own course, to seek employment, perhaps go into business or return to school. None of that suited me. But I was hired on for another slave ship. Yes, I'll talk to you about that in a moment. But when we returned to Liverpool, I was given an invitation to the friends of my dear mother. And so I accepted. And there I met Mary Catlett, who had become the love of my life. As soon as I set my eyes upon her, I fell madly in love. She was 17 and I was but 14, but I determined that I was going to make her my wife. At the end of the visit, her mother detained me, and she said, "Mr. Newton, we loved your dear mother, and my husband and I have noted your interest in Mary. But she's only 14, and she's not ready to make a decision. But my husband and I have agreed for an understanding that when you return from your voyages, we shall see some evidence of stability and prospect." Prospect? Yes, Mr. Newton, prospect. The prospect of a steady living so that you can provide for Mary. Well, yes, Miss Catlett, I understand, and I'll soon return. So with a joy in my heart, a new goal in life, I was hired aboard a ship, a slave ship, where I would seek my fortune, advance myself, and be able to return to England and marry my dear Polly. That was the name I gave to Mary Catlett. Well, I must tell you something about the slave trade. It was at its zenith at this time, and we sailed what we called the Triangular. It was a sailing route that would take us from England. We'd load our ships with goods, and we'd sail to the west coast of Africa, where we'd anchor offshore. And there we would negotiate with the native villagers, the chiefs. You see, one village would have war with another. And the victors would take any surviving men, women, and children in chains to the coast of Africa, and there trade them with the Spanish, with the English, with the Dutch. They wanted three things: muskets, brandy, and clothing. They offered us three things: men, women, and children. But often we'd cheat them, We'd give them wet gunpowder, rusty muskets, watered down brandy, moth-eaten clothing. But it was English clothing, and they'd wear it with great delight, prancing about like proud roosters, until they discovered, after we pulled out of port, that they'd been cheated. Well, this became a great problem for the next ship that came in, because they'd be waiting in ambush for them, because we had cheated them. And so this went back and forth, where they had severe gun battles, if you will, and great losses on both sides, until they came up with a system of a trader representing both sides, sort of an honest broker. But the conditions of the slave trade were absolutely horrific. We loaded them on board, sometimes, depending on the size of the ship, 200, 400, 600. And we'd sail from the west coast of Africa to the West Indies and to the Carolinas here in your America. And there, the slaves were brought ashore to be sold to the plantation owners for 40 pounds English sterling. If that were equivalent to today's US dollars in currency, we're talking about $10,000 per slave. But a good third of them would perish at sea through shipwreck or sickness. If one of them became very ill, and it did not appear he was going to recover, he was callously thrown overboard for fear that his disease would infect our entire cargo and we'd lose all of our money. So there was nothing at the time that particularly bothered me. I was at first repulsed by it. But because of my own wickedness and sinful condition, I soon became calloused to it. Eventually, I returned to Liverpool at the end of a voyage, and one of the older sailors warned me, "John Newton, you'd better be careful." "Sir?" "The press gangs are about." Press gangs. We were at war with France, and it was legal at the time for British sailors to roam the countryside seeking able young men and legally kidnap them and bring them aboard a British warship. I thought, I can outrun them. And so I spent my night in the tavern, exited to the alley in my drunken stupor, and turned and looked, and there were 3 British sailors eyeing me. I turned on my heel to go the other way, and there were 4 more. And soon I was cuffed and brought aboard the HMS Orange, a British warship. I was extremely angry and resentful. I thought it was God's fault to have been taken away against my will from my dear Polly. And every day at sea represented a day further from the hope of ever marrying my dear Polly. I detested it. The discipline was harsh and unforgiving. But I was no fool. And I was beginning to plot my escape. And I noticed that when we came into port, the seamen were under close supervision, and they had a curfew to be back aboard ship at a certain time. But the officers had no such restrictions. They simply had to be back when the ship was ready to sail. And I thought, if I worked hard and impressed the officers, I would seek promotion. "Aye, sir. Right away, sir. Yes, sir." And the officers noticed my hard work and recommended me for promotion. And the ship's captain said, "Mr. Newton, you've been highly recommended for promotion to midshipman," which was the lowest grade of officer. "Would you be interested?" I said, "Aye, yes, sir." "All right, you are now promoted to midshipman." And the sailors that I had once worked side by side were now under my charge. And I took my burning anger out on them. I bullied those under me. "Set the mainsail, belay the shrouds, mend those sails. What kind of a knot do you call that, sailor? That's sloppy work. I'm reducing your rations this evening." And this is the way I treated them. And sure enough, one day, my golden opportunity presented itself. I was charged with taking a party ashore to reload supplies and then to accord the seamen a brief shore leave, but with careful instructions that I was to give them to be sure to be back at the end of curfew. And I warned them of the penalty for desertion. It was as though the master was asking the cat to guard the cream. And I said, "Off with you." And then I turned to take my 2 days' journey to Kent. I was not thinking very clearly in those days, to revisit my dear Polly. The first day was essentially uneventful. But the second day, I was intercepted by a group of British Army officers on horseback. "John Henry Newton, we have a warrant for your address and to be immediately taken into custody for desertion from His Majesty's Royal Navy." And I was chained and brought about the ship. The next day, the captain assembled the entire crew on the top deck. And the charges were read. John Henry Newton, guilty of the charge of desertion from His Majesty's Navy, punishable by death or by any lesser punishment as deemed appropriate by the ship's captain. Captain, would be your judgment, sir? Mr. Newton is to be stripped of all rank. 12 lashes with the cat to be administered. No one is to speak to Mr. Newton for 7 days. 3 days of bread and water. I lay on the deck barely conscious, boiling with volcanic anger. But the tender voice of my mother would come time and time again. And despite my best efforts, I could never shake it off. Wee John, the way of transgressors is hard. I was taken below decks, and the next morning, one of those seamen that had been under my short command brought me my bread and water. Well, if it isn't Mr. High and Mighty, it's my pleasure to bring you your finely prepared 2-course meal. Bon appetit! And then the next morning, well, top of the morning to you, sir. I've brought you the chef's choice. It's been our earnest prayer, Mr. Newton, that you'll soon be well, because we need another hand swabbing the deck. A few days later, we intercepted a merchant vessel. And it was maritime law that in the need of the time of war for a British warship to conscript sailors from the merchant vessel, provided he traded in kind and afforded the merchant vessel seamen, allegedly able-bodied seamen, so he wouldn't be left underhanded. And so I was traded to a slave ship under the command of a Mr. Phelps, captain of that ship. I didn't really care for Mr. Phelps, and he obviously didn't care for me. Observing my work and my sullen attitude, well, that's a sloppy bit of work there, Newton. No wonder they flogged you on the Orange. Well, I kind of liked the crew. We got along fairly well. And one evening I decided to break into the ship's room, have a party with me mates. And I had them join me in a song that I had written about Mr. Phelps. Have you ever seen the like since you've been to sea? Let the good ship rock. A bandy-legged captain with a bent-back knee, a wobbling down the dock. Let the good ship roll and rock. Let the good ship roll and rock. Unbeknownst to me, Mr. Phelps was looking from above and heard me scornful little song. The next day, one of my mates come to me and says, Newton, you better be watching your step, man. I overheard the first mate talking to the captain, and I overheard Mr. Phelps say, we'll soon be off the coast of Sierra Leone. I've got plans for Mr. Newton. Unbeknownst to me, I was out to become a slave myself. The next morning, Mr. Phelps announced, we're going ashore to make my trade. I want 3 of you to row me ashore. Hartsmith, Smythe, Newton. And ashore we went. And I noticed him negotiating with the trader. And my mate said, ooh, admiring the ladies walking along the beach. This might not be such a bad place after all. What do you think, Newton? I said, you men are daft. I want to get back to England and see my Polly. And then Mr. Phelps and the trader approached me. And Mr. Phelps announced, Harkness, Smythe, make ready the boat. Mr. Campbell, this is John Newton, the man I talked to you about. Newton, you're staying here, sir. I traded you. You're going to be the servant to Mr. Campbell. How do you like them apples, Mr. Funny Man? So Mr. Campbell gave signal to his guards to turn me about and lifted my shirt. So I see you've tasted the lash. You disobey, you'll be tasting it again. You're going to be servant to my wife, Princess P. She's always wanted a white man for a slave, and now she's got one. Guards, take him to Princess Peggy. Mr. Newton, my little white man. Newton, I don't like that look in your eye. We must break him, tie him to the post outside the hut. And so I was shackled to a post outside the hut where the other slaves were kept. I don't know how long I was there, laying for days in the burning sun, in the pouring rain, barely kept alive with enough food and water. Even the slaves inside the hut had compassion on me and brought me bits of their own meager portions and shared it with me. They had more compassion on me than I ever had on them during my days as a slave seaman. And one morning, I was awakened with the tip of a spear. Newton, we take you to Princess Peggy. You do what she bids you. You disobey, we whip you. You run away, we find you. We hurt you. You run away second time, we kill you. But in such a way that you will pray for death to come quickly. Do you understand? There. Report to Princess Peggy. Oh, Mr. Newton, my little white man, you must be very hungry. Are you hungry, Newton? Well, here's some food for you. But you must beg, my little white man. Get down on your knees like dog. I want to hear you bark, Newton. Yes, Newton, like that. And now I want you to beg like dog. Up on your knees, Newton. Yes, like that. Here's your food. She threw it on the ground, and I scoffed it up like I'd never eaten a meal before in my life. She worked me like a mule, sometimes for her own entertainment, telling me to go gather woods from the forest, bring it to the main house. Oh, Newton, good job. Now, take it back exactly where you found it. And then there were days that I had hours upon hours to myself, tending a little garden, trying to grow some lime. And one day I was brought to the house of the Mr. Campbell and his wife, and lo and behold, I discovered a mathematics book on the table. I slipped it under my shirt and took it back to my little post where I tended to my garden and the lime trees. But to keep me from going insane, I began to study the book of mathematics and scribble in the sand geometrical figures and equations. And one day, Mr. Campbell happened to pass by with the princess. And he noted, said, Newton, what's this? I said, mathematical equations, sir, and geometrical figures. Newton, do you understand the mathematics? A little bit, yes, sir. I've kind of taught myself. Well, maybe you're not quite as worthless as I first thought. Yes, and Newton, maybe one day you become king of Poland. Newton, I want you at the house this afternoon. Yes, sir. And so I reported, and he sat me down at a table, and he broke out a piece of paper with mathematical problems on them, handed me a quill, and said, solve these. He compared my answers to the book and said, perfect. You're going to work for my brother. He's got a trading post here on the island and needs someone to keep the books. Serve him well, you'll be well treated. Fail him, you'll be right back here. Guards, take him to Angus. That was his brother's name. And I reported to Angus Campbell. He gave me a new change of clothing, fed me well. We actually got along quite well. And I kept his books. The number of slaves bought and sold, the amount of goods that were traded. And one day, a sea captain of a merchant vessel came into the office where I was keeping the books. He said, "Are you John Newton?" I said, "Yes, sir. I've been sailing up and down the coast of West Africa for months, looking for you." "Sir, your father has paid me and given me a ransom to find you and bring you back to England." "My father?" I nearly fell out. And standing there on the beach, I turned to Captain Gotha as we awaited the longboat to take me to his ship, the Greyhound, to bring me back to England. And I said, "You know, Captain, if I believed in God, I would almost have thought, almost believe that it was his hand that sent you to find me." The captain turned to me and said, "Believe it, Newton, believe it." And I was a passenger, no responsibilities, allowed to relax. And I began reading some books. One of the books I read was a book by Thomas à Kempis, The Imitation of Christ. And as I read it, my mother's verses would come back to me. And I began to think, if these things are true, is it possible that I've turned my back on the very God who's been trying to save me? March 10th, 1748. As I was meditating and reading, just before nightfall, a sudden clap of thunder broke, and the ship began to list violently to port, to starboard, up and down. We were in a most dreadful storm, the worst I'd ever seen in my life. And it wasn't long before water began to leak through the hull, and we were taking our clothing and trying to stuff it into the leaks. And the captain said, "Newton, I need you at the helm. I've got to supervise the manning of the pumps." Up to the helm I went, and the man that preceded me was immediately washed overboard. No time to lament him. I lashed myself to the helm and stood there for 12 hours while we battled that storm, trying to keep some steady course, lest we be driven to and fro by the storm. And then a cry, a desperate cry from below. "It's lost, all is lost. There's a great gaping hole in the hull. We can't keep it afloat. Abandon ship." I don't know where the thought came from. It was almost instinctive. I looked to heaven and I said, God save us." And then immediately, I heard reproving verses coming back from my mother's early instruction. "You've not regarded my proof. Now I am laughing at your calamity." I couldn't remember the exact verse, but its effect was powerful. Then I thought I was finished, that I was going to die that night. And whether it was my own conscience or the devil, I thought, "Newton, you filthy blasphemer, you're going to call on God now, are you? Well, let me tell you something, John Newton. You belong to me, and you'll be in hell with me tonight." Oh, God, have mercy on us. And in a moment, the ship suddenly listed violently to port. And the wooden battles of beeswax floating behind the sea-soaked bales of cotton slid across the deck and slammed into the hull and plugged up the hole sufficiently to allow us to man the pumps and bail enough water to keep us afloat. And 2 days later, the skies cleared, and we drifted for the next 3 weeks to the coast of Ireland. I had many hours to contemplate the events in my life and to reflect. And I count that as my day of conversion. March 10th, 1748. I was an infant in the faith. I had no background. But the desire of my heart was to seek God's mercy and instruction. And then we lighted onto the shore of Ireland. Without any embarrassment at all, I got down on my knees and I said, "Oh, God, thank you. Thank you. Please show me your mercy and instruct me." and I made it back to England. It so happens that the owner of the ship that rescued me hired me as a first mate. And now with my living secure, it was time for me to go and ask for the hand of Polly in marriage. And so I married my Polly. And then I was promoted from first mate to captain of my own ship. But it was a slave ship. You may ask yourself, how could you do that? Claim to be a Christian now. And you were once a slave yourself. But as I said, I was an infant in the faith. And in those days, it was considerable to be an honorable profession. Everyone of any means in England was invested in it, and somehow, even the ships, the insurance, the plantations, the goods that were being brought back to England, molasses, rum, cotton, and there was very little questioning of the slave trade. But on my third voyage, my final voyage, I became much troubled. I felt more like a jailer than a captain, even though I made sure our slaves were brought up on deck for daily exercise to keep them healthy, and made sure there was sufficient nourishment for them, made sure that their quarters were cleaned on a daily basis, my crew well paid and on time. But my heart was greatly troubled over the whole concept. And so I returned home to Polly and was planning my next voyage. And suddenly I fell to the floor in convulsions. And the physician determined that I either had a stroke or a seizure. But the owner of the ship deemed I was not fit to command another ship at sea. And during my recuperation, I had lots of time to reflect, to thank God for his unbelievable mercy. I studied the scriptures during this time. I actually taught myself enough Greek and Hebrew, not critical in those skills, but enough to better understand the passages of scripture I was reading. And I don't know why, but I began writing sermons, as though I was preaching to someone about the infinite love and mercy of God Almighty. And there arose in my heart a desire to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so I'm going to ask Miss Karen to come, because to finish the conclusion of my story, a change of clothing is warranted. Well, my hopes, unfortunately, for becoming a preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ were soon dimmed. I applied to the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the established Church of England, and was turned down by all of them. But I continued to receive invitations to preach and to share my experiences, and I was received very well. And other invitations became more and more frequent. And finally, I was invited to preach in the great church of London. And sitting in the audience was George Whitefield, Isaac Watts, John Wesley. And I had time to commune with them, and they greatly encouraged me in my growing faith and confirmed the call that I felt I had in answer to my mother's prayer some 33 years later. She always had the view of raising me for the ministry if the Lord so inclined my heart. And now, 33 years later, I was seeking just that opportunity. And one day, I received a post. Maddie, read this. John, you're to be the pastor at our church in Olney. It's an answer to our prayers and an answer to my mother's prayers. In 1772, I was preparing a message, and we were a poor church of small means. We had no hymn books, we couldn't afford them. And as the pastor, I would write a poem and set it to music common to our congregation, Mad Robin or Black-Eyed Susan. And the purpose of my poem, which became a hymn, was to punch home the message that I was delivering. I worked in collaboration with a gifted poet by the name of William Cowper. You may not realize you've heard of him. He wrote the hymn that is a fountain filled with blood. And so for the New Year's service of 1772, I had selected as my text 1 Chronicles chapter 17, verse 16, where King David was reflecting upon his life and saying, O Lord my God, who hath brought me hitherto. And I thought of my own life, what a wretch I was. Not the man that I want to be, not the man I hope to be, but by the mercy and grace of Almighty God, I shall become the man I hope to be. And as I reflected on my own life and thought where God had brought me, I began to write, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. Once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Believe it or not, that hymn fell into relative obscurity in England. But some of the Methodists and Baptist preachers and missionaries going to the colonies in America took it with them, and it grew in great popularity. And someone set it to a new tune. But under the preaching of George Whitefield, accompanied with John and Charles Wesley, during their evangelization campaign known as the Great Awakening, the hymn, Amazing Grace, grew in great popularity. I take no credit for it. It's simply the work of God's hand with someone who is willing to be used. And it's estimated that this hymn is sung some 10 million times annually. Perhaps the best known and one of the most beloved hymns in English Christendom. And so at this time, I would like to ask you to join our gifted musicians and our talented song leader into a singing of the hymn, I Was Privileged by the Grace of God. It's not the amazing story of John Newton. It's the story of John Newton's amazing God.